Why, hello everybody. It's Friday. You made it through another week. It is April 10th today, I think. Sunday is Easter, so we're on a little Good Friday hike here. We are at the Bridge Creek Conservation Area in Barnstable. Directly in front of me is Church Street, and we're going to kind of mosey on back in the direction of where my car is parked, which is at the fire station over off of exit 5 on 149. We're going to walk down a path over this way. It's kind of a really interesting day. 5 minutes ago it was sunny and beautiful. 5 minutes before that it was hailing. So who knows what we're going to get today. It is a little bit chilly, but it's not a terrible walk. I hope that you guys all had a good week. News is still not looking good. I don't know who's paying attention to it, but don't get too depressed. We've been through stuff like this before and came out just right on the other side. So we're gonna walk down the path and we're gonna talk a little bit about history, because we are in an area that has been occupied by people let me rephrase that has been occupied by European colonists since about 1650 or so. So I want you to put yourselves back into that time. Let's go back to, say, 1720, 1730. You live on a homestead. Your grandparents are probably there, as are your parents and yourselves. It has been long enough, 100 years, that there may be 3 generations. If you think about it, if your grandparents are alive and your parents are alive and you're alive, that's maybe 75 to 100 years. So this area that we're at has a rock wall, right? And that rock wall would have been used to mark the border between the properties and or to keep livestock in. So all of this area that we see in front of us would have been cleared. There only would have been a couple of trees here. It would have all been cleared because they built their boats out of it. They built their homes out of wood. They cooked their food with wood. Everything was wood. And so there wouldn't have been anything here. It would have been these rock walls. It would have been open grassland where they would have been feeding the livestock. The cows would have been here by then, sheep, goats, maybe some pigs. They would have had an extensive garden. So we live in a modern age where we can go anywhere that we want, pretty much, and have food readily available to us. This is not the case in 1750. They would have had to grow all of the food that they ate. They might have bartered with their neighbors. They would have had chickens for eggs. They would have had goats and cows for milk. And so all of that would have required that the land be cleared so that they also had food for that livestock and those animals. So they would have built these rock walls that we see. Yes, these rock walls may be 350 years old. And then we would have had this area all cleared. And we'll get back to that in a minute, because there are still some signs of that stuff from long ago. But one of the things I want to show you is an interesting thing we have here on Cape Cod. And this is called a vernal pool, right? So this is a depression in the woods where there is water right now. At the height of the summer, this water won't be here anymore, but it is for right now. It has not been warm enough at night for enough nights in a row for the amphibians to come out and lay their eggs. I've already taken a really good hard look to see if there's any egg masses in here, and there isn't. But once we have 3 nights that are over 50 degrees, this little area will be filled with eggs. Eggs of wood frogs, eggs of tree frogs, eggs of spotted salamanders, eggs of other salamanders, loaded with eggs. And they will all hatch, turn into tadpoles, and crawl out onto the land within a week or two. It all happens very, very quickly. So this is an important part of our ecology on Cape Cod, this vernal pool, and it does not last for a very long time. This is my first time in this area. I'm not sure how wet this stays in the summer, but for the most part, vernal pools completely dry up. Don't know if you can see on the other side there, there's also a large rhododendron bush. We are all familiar with rhododendrons. Many of us have them in their yards. I walked over there. There seems to be something kind of denned up underneath it. Could be foxes, could be coyotes. I didn't get too close, but it's nice and thick, but well oxygenated, so it's a good shelter for some animal over there. Interesting thing about rhododendrons. Rhododendrons, there are about 100 species of rhododendrons. 90% of those species of rhododendrons exist in Asia, in India, in Malaysia, and about 10% of them exist here in North America. We're not entirely sure why we ended up with these widely disparate populations of essentially the same tree all the way across the world. It's an interesting thing for geneticists to try to figure out. Another kind of similar example of that is when I was working on the Nautilus with Dr. Ballard. We had an Israeli team that was studying the genetics of corals. They had these corals that were growing on the seawalls off of Israel in the Mediterranean Sea. Their closest living relative was on a giant rock in the Gulf of Maine. So we have these two populations of corals that are basically brother and sister, and they're completely divided amongst the different parts of the world. So that is very interesting, and I find that interesting with the rhododendrons as well. So let me turn back to the path here. So again, we see the rock wall, and then over here we have an example of a rock they couldn't move. I don't remember. If you remember, we talked a couple weeks ago about how Cape Cod was formed, and it was formed by a giant glacier called the Laurentide Glacier. This is an example of what they call an erratic, E-R-R-A-T-I-C. This is a rock that was in the glacier, and it fell out and plopped onto the ground. It's giant. They're often left right where they were by the original settlers and people who lived in this area because they're just too big to move. There are some rather gigantic ones on the outer Cape, and at some point we'll talk about those and these interesting little rocks that we call ventifacts as well. Miss Mary Beers, who works with me, is really knowledgeable about the ventifacts. Really cool stuff. So continue on the path. They've been here doing some work. You can start to see the green really popping up over there. We're going to get closer to those plants because they're a plant that I guarantee you've seen. Many of you know what they are and never thought about it. Remember that I have said that your backyard is an amazing place. Let me say that one more time. Your backyard is an amazing place. You don't have to go far to find really cool things. We see things on the television all the time, exotic birds, exotic plants. We have that right here. At some point, we will look at a caddisfly larva, and you will be like, oh my God, I can't believe it. That's an amazing thing. So one of those things that's pretty amazing, we're coming up to right now, is a plant Some of you may know it. It's called a skunk cabbage. It's called a skunk cabbage because, as you can imagine, it gives off a horrendous odor when you break its leaves. So it smells like a skunk. They think that's maybe so that other animals don't eat it that much. It also has big leaves, like a head of cabbage, but it's not really a cabbage. So I'm going to get really close to one of these. Okay? You guys have seen this. It's one of the first plants that comes up in this swamp. This little bit right here, that is the flower. It usually comes up first, and then the cabbage starts to grow outside of the flower, right? You can see the part in there that would have the pollen, and then the leaves are very broad and green. They're not edible. I wouldn't recommend eating them. They stink when you break them. They are one of the first plants to come up. They come up so early, in fact, that they have developed a strategy of being warmer than the ice around them. They have something that happens in the cells that warms up, and they're actually able to melt ice and snow and push through the ice and snow. It's called thermogenic. It's a thermogenic plant. It's a plant that creates its own heat. That is amazing. And it's right here in our backyard. Common all over Cape Cod, right? That is pretty amazing. Another thing we see when we come down to these areas, we see plants, trees that kind of get tipped over, right? See the root bundle on that tree? We don't have much topsoil to speak of here on the Cape. So our trees, our bigger trees, don't really get a good solid root structure. We've got about 6 inches of topsoil, and then it becomes sand. So when it gets really windy, lots of trees get toppled fairly easily, as this one did. If you were to go to Orleans and go down the red maple trail, you would see giant red maples that are tipped over all the time. Very common. But it also gives us an insight into how that root structure is and how it does hold stuff together while it's there. All right, continue walking a little bit. We're going to start to look for evidence that this was a place where we kept cattle or had property lines. Remember that in 1750 or so, the time we started talking about, there were almost no trees on Cape Cod. They were all cut down. That's one of the reasons we don't have a lot of topsoil, because we let it all wash away. But farmers were pragmatists. And they knew that they needed to keep certain things in order to keep cattle safe, things like that. In the summertime, it would get very hot and the sun would bake down. We're all familiar with that. And of course, we didn't have air conditioning or sprinkler systems and stuff like that in 1750. So we're going to, in a little while, get to a particular tree, which is something interesting here in New England. Okay? Let's see. What else can we see? I believe that crocus flowers are thermogenic also. Yes. I'm sorry. Robin, yes. Crocuses are thermogenic to be able to push themselves up through the snow. The interesting thing is that these flowers, like the skunk cabbage and the crocus, need to be pollinated, just like any other flower. And the pollinating insects aren't really active until it gets to be 50 degrees. So these plants they're coming up first to be the first ones up to be pollinated and to take advantage of the lack of competition, right? But sometimes they have to be able to stay in that state until they have the right temperatures. One of the things we have noticed is that flowers are popping up a little earlier. We talked the other day that we know that robins are coming about 2 weeks earlier in their migration. So we've seen this kind of subtle shift over time of things happening a little bit earlier. We used to think that all those things were really based upon the length of the day, which has not changed substantially, but temperatures have started to slowly rise. All right, here's another example of how we kind of know this was an area that was farmed at one point in time. This is a really kind of tall tree. Got weak and it died. When we look at the bark, here's a big piece of the bark on the ground. We might make the assumption that this is a birch tree because this looks like kind of birch bark. But in fact, it's not. In fact, this is an old cherry tree. It's probably a cherry tree that was planted by the farmer that was here, and it was able to get really big like this because it didn't have any plants or trees around it blocking the sunlight. Now, trees have a lifespan just like everything else does. So this tree may have either just met the end of its life because of its age, or it might have gotten sick, but eventually the wind blew it over, as did that one. That's a cherry tree as well that's leaning over there. So the two cherry trees together, I think there's a third over there, indicate that this was a little batch of cherry trees that they got. They would have been eating these cherries, canning these cherries, baking these cherries, drying these cherries, doing everything that they could. We don't live in what we call an agrarian society right now. In the 1750s, it was a completely farming society. You had to feed yourselves. You had to feed neighbors. You maybe had to supply food to the local militias and to the British military that were here. So you focused a lot of your energy on growing stuff. That would be plants, that would be cattle, that would be goats. Of course, there was a lot of hunting. By the time 1750 came around, so there we go. There's another part of that rock wall, and that's going to come into play in a minute as well. You would have needed to produce a lot of food, right? You wouldn't have had the variety that you get from the grocery. Your variety would have come from what you were able to grow. You would grow a lot of potatoes, a lot of onions, things that would grow that you could keep over the winter when things got really, really tough. You would salt cod, you would dry beef. So again, there's that rock wall. This whole area wouldn't have had anything growing on it. And then we come to this tree. This big white pine, which is kind of on the edge of the rock wall, which means this would have been a pasture where there were cattle. This type of pine that we find in New England is what we call a second generation tree. When the European colonists came and started settling into the area, they left certain trees that they did not cut. And the reason that they didn't cut them was because they provided shade for the cattle or the livestock that were in the field, or shelter during the rain. So these trees were able to get much bigger. And these are called wolf pines. They tend to be white pines in this area. There is no really old growth forest left in New England unless you get up into Maine. Being the first area that was kind of inhabited by European settlers, they literally cut everything down. If we put you in a time machine back to 1760, I think you would be amazed at how little trees there actually were. So this is a wolf pine. This is a tree that would have been standing when the farmers were working this field back before the Revolutionary War. I'm not sure what the lifespan is of this actual tree, how much longer it has to live. It looks pretty healthy. Looks like a branch blew down. But yeah, that's a wolf pine. And we see a few of them in the woods around Cape Cod, left here on purpose. Left here on purpose. Some of the original trees. Kind of gucky, mucky. It's been raining a lot the last couple of days, which is good for the vernal pools and good for the water table. Not so good for the hiking. One of the things I like right now is that we can kind of come out here and do this, and I'm not bumping into any other people. It's tough for me. I'm a guy who likes to be social. I started a tour company. That should indicate that I like interacting with people. So I'm glad that you're here with me doing this. This is as close as I'm going to get, I guess. Oh, here we go. Another wolf pine. Nice one. See? The reason those boughs were able to grow out like that is because there weren't other trees here to block it. It's pretty big, right? These other trees, look, they're very tall and skinny. That is a scrub pine, and it won't last too tremendously long. Ooh, I can hear a hawk. That's a blue jay. But I just heard a hawk, a bunch of birds giving alarm calls, so probably a decent hawk around. This is the kind of woods I've been really looking for an owl. I haven't seen an owl, but this is definitely the kind of woods where you would find an owl. So here's another really cool tree, right? See this tree with the interesting bark right here? There's a couple of them. And they have fallen down, right? So this tree with a really interesting bark is called a black locust. That one's broken off, right? But there's a few around here, and these were probably planted as a crop because this wood has one of what they call the strongest beam strengths of any wood that grows in North America. So when you go into an old house, like the Hoxie house in Sandwich, it's not unlikely that the beams that hold the roof together are made of this. This is called a black locust tree. The wood is really, really hard. There are some locust trees that also have kind of thorns in them, but the bark, it's really neat. I don't know if you can hear that. I mean, it feels kind of like the texture of cork. It's a really distinctive bark. And there's a few trees here, which indicates that it was probably planted as a crop, and now they're reaching the end of their life and starting to fall down. Red trail, so red mark. So we're on the right trail. Keeping track. I came through here one time, wasn't paying attention, came out somewhere way out on 6A, had no idea where I was. It's almost impossible to get lost here on Cape Cod. You're going to come out on some road you're probably going to know. But still, nobody likes to walk that far if they don't have to. All right, so lots of holly through here. We talked about holly before. The ones with berries are females. The ones that don't have berries are males. And yes, in fact, there are male and female trees. Lots of different species, actually. Some folks have been through here working, which is pretty good. So, I don't know. Let's see if we can zoom in. There was one over here earlier I was keeping an eye on. So there is, in that tree right there. Can you see that in the middle? It's a hole. So I have been looking here a couple of times to see what animal might be in and out of there, because there's definitely going to be a bird nesting in there, but I don't know. I looked a couple times. I was hoping maybe there's another bigger hole in a tree over there, but I can't really get a good look at it. I can't really carry the binoculars when I'm with you guys because I have to carry the phone. So that's a little tough. I don't bring a guidebook either because I don't want to take away from my conversation with you. Well, let's see. Some lichen. Lots of lichen on the stump here. Remember we said that lichen are a combination of algae and fungus living together. The algae feed off of the carbohydrates that the fungus create, and so they kind of slow growing and very in tough situations is where lichen live. And look, we're back over here to the rock wall, marking some property that used to be here. Maybe it just divided fields from one another. It may have divided properties from one another. They would have had a lot. Here's another example of one of those big cherry trees. See that interesting bark where the grooves go horizontally instead of vertically? This is a big tree right here. Wow. Right? Again, they would have harvested those cherries. They probably would have had a pretty good orchard with apples. In case you don't know, they've traced all apples back to an original wild apple forest in Kazakhstan, which is in Western Asia. That's a pretty amazing thing, that it's an actual beautiful apple forest. There's other little fruits and nuts and stuff there too, but it is primarily apples, and all apples come from Kazakhstan. Now, another interesting thing, you might take a Macintosh apple, and you could take the seed out of a Macintosh apple. There's no guarantee that if you planted that seed, a Macintosh tree would grow. Let me say that again. You could take a Macintosh apple, take the seed out of a Macintosh apple, and there's no guarantee that a Macintosh apple tree will grow. It could be a different kind of apple. Don't ask me why. Don't ask me how. I just know that it is so. Oh, look, somebody found something interesting. So these are some bits of metal that are here. Maybe that's a horseshoe, maybe. Tough to say. Another piece of metal somebody probably dug up when they were working. Again, indicators of how long the land has been worked. It would have been probably field and farm until the late 1800s, early 1900s, which would have been plenty of time to have lots of metal work through here. It is a pretty gorgeous day. Again, it was hailing earlier. It's crazy. For those of you who've been with me for a couple days, I am working on a better way to get the plankton onto the Facebook Live. I am not technologically proficient, but my son is, and he's been helping me. So hopefully by Wednesday, we'll be all set with that live plankton stuff. I do need some suggestions for stuff that you guys would like me to cover. I've got plankton covered on Wednesday. I'd love to know if there's any places on the Cape that you'd like me to go, or even in the south of Boston area, any trails or beaches or dunes or anything like that. I'm definitely open to suggestions, or any animals or plants that you would like me to talk about. I have now done, I think, 20 of these presentations, and while I consider myself to be kind of an imaginative guy, I want to make them interesting for you, what you guys are looking for. I'm not sure that barnacles is that, even though barnacles are pretty amazing. So if you have any ideas, you can comment here, or you can message me on the Facebook app, or you can email me at captainawesome@capecodlearningtours.com. calm. And believe it or not, that has been a half an hour. We're going to start being on the Channel 99 community media next week. That'll be fun. Thanks for joining me. I hope you guys all have a great weekend. Be safe, be kind, and I'll see you on Monday. All right, everybody? Bye-bye.